In the sacred groves of the West Slavs, where sunbeams pierced the dense foliage of oaks and birches, stood the sanctuaries of a goddess whose name signified the very essence of existence. Zhiva. This deity personified the inextinguishable force of life that permeated every creature, every plant, every breath of the world. Her name originated from an ancient root that the Slavs infused into their words: to live a lively life. This goddess was the embodiment of spring, fertility, and the eternal rebirth of nature after winter's oblivion. Ancient chronicles and records of the West Slavs preserved mentions of Zhiva, as well as of the supreme deity of the Pelagian tribes. These tribal unions, living between the Elbe and the Oder, especially revered the goddess of life, building her temples on high hills where she could survey all the lands under her patronage. Soviet researcher Dmitry Sergeyevich Likachev, studying Novgorod and Smolensk sources, suggested that Zhiva was embodied by the supreme god Rod along with Svarog at the very beginning of the world's creation. According to this version, Zhiva became the first manifestation of life in the newly created universe, the breath that animated inanimate matter. Other legends name Zhiva as the daughter of the goddess Lada, the great mother of all Slavic deities. In this case, Zhiva appeared as a natural continuation of the harmony and love that Lada brought into the world. The goddess of life was depicted as a young, beautiful woman with long, fair hair, enveloped in flowers and sunshine. Her robes shimmered with all the shades of green, from the delicate lime of the first spring shoots to the deep emerald of summer foliage. In her hands, she held ears of ripe wheat or apples, symbols of harvest and fertility. Zhiva was not merely an abstract concept of life. She actively influenced the destinies of people, animals, and plants. The Slavs believed that it was this goddess who decided which seed would sprout, which cub would be born healthy, and which woman would give birth safely. Her blessing was necessary for any endeavor, any undertaking requiring growth and development. Peasants turned to Zhiva in the spring when they sowed grain into the earth, asking her to revive each seed, to give it the strength to break through the soil and transform into an ear. Women prayed to her for children, believing that it was Zhiva who gave souls the opportunity to incarnate as newborns. The cult of Zhiva particularly flourished in the lands of the West Slavs in the early centuries of our era. In cities and villages, sacred groves were dedicated to her, where it was forbidden to cut down trees, hunt animals, or even pick flowers without necessity. These groves were considered the very body of the goddess and her material manifestation in the world of humans. Entering such a grove, a person felt a special atmosphere of peace and grace, as if life itself embraced them with its invisible arms. Temples of Zhiva were built of light wood, adorned with carvings of birds, flowers, and the sun. Within the temple, a sacred fire always burned, which the priests maintained day and night. For fire, too, was a manifestation of life force. Before the goddess's altar stood a statue of linden or birch, covered with fabrics of green and gold. The idol's eyes were inlaid with amber, which glowed in the temple's semi-darkness, like the living gaze of the goddess herself. The priests of Zhiva wore white robes adorned with embroidery of floral patterns. They were keepers of ancient knowledge about medicinal herbs, the cycles of nature, and the laws of growth and development of all living things. These priests healed the sick, assisted women in childbirth, blessed newlyweds, and consecrated new homes and fields. Their authority was undisputed, as it was believed they spoke with the voice of the goddess of life herself. The spring equinox, when day equaled night and life began its advance against the kingdom of winter death, was celebrated with particular solemnity. On this day, processions from surrounding villages came to Zhiva's temples. People carried the first spring flowers, milk, freshly baked bread, and honey from the previous year's harvest. All these offerings were placed before the altar, and the priests recited prayers, invoking the goddess to bless the coming season. After the ceremony, festive celebrations began with songs, dances, and games, which were intended to symbolically awaken the earth from its winter slumber. Zhiva interacted closely with other deities of the Slavic pantheon. With Mokosh, the goddess of fate, she shared power over human lives, but their functions differed. If Mokosh determined the length and pattern of each person's thread of life, Zhiva provided the very possibility for this life to exist, filling it with energy and strength. One could say that Mokosh created the form, and Zhiva filled it with content. Both goddesses were revered by women, but in different circumstances. Mokosh was invoked at the moment of childbirth, asking for easy delivery and a successful outcome, while Zhiva was prayed to during pregnancy, so that the child in the womb would grow healthy and strong. With Yarilo, the god of the spring sun and awakening nature, Zhiva formed a natural pair. Yarilo symbolized the fertilizing force, and Zhiva, the receptive and nurturing energy. Together, they ensured the continuation of life on Earth, the endless cycle of birth, growth, ripening, fading, and new birth. In some regions, there were rituals of symbolic union between Yarilo and Zhiva, performed in spring, which were intended to guarantee a good harvest and livestock fertility. Zhiva's opposite in Slavic cosmology was Mara, the goddess of death and winter. If Zhiva brought warmth, light, and growth, Mara brought cold, darkness, and decay. But the Slavs did not consider Mara an evil goddess, as they understood death as a necessary part of the cosmic order. Without winter's sleep, the earth could not yield a new harvest. Without the death of the old, there could be no birth of the new. Zhiva and Mara were two sides of the same coin, eternal adversaries and simultaneously complementary forces. Great Mokosh, the goddess who spun the thread of human destinies, had two daughters, whose names the Slavs uttered with hope and fear, Dolya and Nedolya. These sisters embodied the opposite principles of human life: happiness and unhappiness, luck and misfortune, prosperity and sorrow. They were not abstract concepts, but were imagined as quite concrete beings, invisibly present alongside each person from the moment of birth to their last breath. The goddess Dolya was depicted as a beautiful young woman in light clothing, with a clear face and kind eyes. In her hands, she held an emerald spindle and spun a smooth golden thread of human destiny. Her presence brought joy, well-being, and success in all endeavors. When Dolya was favorably disposed to a person, their affairs seemed to run smoothly on their own. Sown grain yielded a rich harvest. Livestock multiplied and did not fall ill. Trade brought profit. Children were born healthy. People favored by Dolya seemed lucky, darlings of fate, although in reality, their success was the result of the goddess's favor. Dolya did not come just like that. She had to be earned through a righteous life, good deeds, and reverence for the gods and ancestors. The Slavs believed that Dolya especially loved hard-working, honest, hospitable people. If a peasant was not lazy, rose at dawn, and worked until sunset, if the housewife kept the house clean and orderly, if the family lived in harmony and accord, Dolya blessed such a home with her presence. She brought not only material well-being but also peace of mind, joy, and a sense of fullness of life. But always near Dolya was her sister, Nedolya, the complete opposite of the bright goddess. Nedolya was imagined as a thin, gloomy woman in dark rags, with a sad or malevolent expression. She spun a crooked, torn thread of destiny, full of knots and breaks. Where Nedolya appeared, misfortune began. Nedolya could spoil any undertaking, even one begun with the best intentions. Because of her, products spoiled, livestock fell ill, tools broke, fires and floods occurred. Nedolya was not necessarily an embodiment of evil. Sometimes she came as punishment for sins, violations of ancient laws, disrespect for the gods. If a person acted dishonestly, deceived, stole or wronged the weak, Nedolya became their constant companion. But sometimes misfortune befell righteous people too, for fate is unpredictable, and the sisters could change places by the will of their mother, Mokosh. Slavic legends told that Dolya and Nedolya were constantly rivals. If Dolya bestowed happiness upon a person, Nedolya immediately sought to offer them unhappiness. If Dolya foretold success in business, Nedolya tried in every way to spoil the plan. This eternal struggle of the sisters reflected the Slavic understanding of life as a constant alternation of joys and sorrows, ups and downs, fortunes and misfortunes. It was impossible to live a life interacting only with Dolya or only with Nedolya. Every person, in different periods of their existence, encountered both sisters. There were rituals designed to attract Dolya and repel Nedolya. When a child was born in a family, the midwife performed a special ritual to invoke Dolya. She circled the cradle 3 times with a lit candle and recited an incantation. Dolya, Dolushka, come to our infant. Bring him happiness, health, wealth. May his life be long and joyful. After this, a silver coin or a piece of bread was placed at the head of the cradle, so that Dolya would know the child came from a good family, ready to receive and honor her. When misfortune befell a family, and it became clear that Nedolya had settled in the house, a ritual of expulsion was performed. The mistress of the house swept the hut with a new broom from the threshold to the door, symbolically sweeping out the evil goddess. As she did so, she recited, "Nedolya, not Delushka, leave our house. No place for you here. No one expects you." After this, the broom was burned at a crossroads so that Nedolya could not return. Sometimes a straw doll was made, dressed in rags, and also burned or drowned in a river, chasing misfortune away from the home. It was especially important to secure Dolya's support in critical moments of life. Before a wedding, the bride prayed to Dolya, asking for a happy marriage and a prosperous family life. She left an offering at the home hearth, kasha, bread, honey, inviting the goddess to become the patroness of the new home. The groom also turned to Dolya, but asked for success in business, a rich household, and healthy children. If the young couple lived harmoniously and worked hard, Dolya remained with them, and their life was happy. Travelers and merchants especially revered Dolya, as their lives depended on chance and luck. Before a long journey, they left a coin for Dolya at a crossroads, asking her to accompany them on their way. If the journey was successful, upon their return, they always brought a thanksgiving offering: bread, beer, a piece of cloth, which they left at a roadside stone or tree. It was believed that the Dolya of wanderers was particularly capricious, as a person on the road was vulnerable and exposed to many dangers. Warriors before battle also invoked Dolya, although the main patron of warriors was Perun. A warrior's Dolya meant not just victory, but also good fortune in battle, to survive among fallen comrades, to avoid serious injury, to capture rich spoils. Some warriors were called Dolavi, meaning those especially favored by the goddess of luck. Such fighters could perform incredible feats, emerge alive from the most dangerous situations, and their comrades tried to stay close to them, hoping that the warrior's Dolya would protect them too. Motherhood was also under Dolya's patronage. Upon becoming pregnant, a woman began to especially revere the goddess, praying for a safe childbirth and a healthy child. During childbirth, the midwife invoked Dolya to help the woman in labor ease her suffering. If a child was born in a shirt, meaning in the amniotic sac, this was considered a sign of Dolya's special favor. "Such a child will grow up happy and lucky," the old women would say. The shirt was carefully kept, and when the child grew up, it was given to them as a talisman, intended to attract Dolya throughout their life. Nedolya could also be invoked, but only with malevolent intentions. There were evil sorcerers and witches who knew how to inflict Nedolya upon their enemies. They performed dark rituals, created curses that bound the evil goddess to the victim. A person upon whom Nedolya was inflicted began to suffer from endless failures. Everything fell apart in their hands. Any undertaking ended in failure. Illnesses followed one after another. It was very difficult to get rid of inflicted Nedolya. The services of a strong healer or seer were required, who could remove the curse. In the popular consciousness, Dolya and Nedolya were not merely mythological figures but real forces that had to be reckoned with every day. Through them, people explained all the vicissitudes of fate, all the unexpected turns of life. If things went well, Dolya is helping. If troubles began, it meant Nedolya has come. Such a worldview helped to accept the blows of fate with equanimity, understanding that misfortunes are not eternal, and sooner or later Nedolya would leave, and Dolya would return. In Slavic mythology, there was a goddess whose name was spoken with awe and fear. Mara, also known as Marena or Marjana. She embodied the dark side of the cosmos: death, winter cold, the fading of life, the inevitable end of all existence. But the Slavs did not consider her an embodiment of absolute evil, for they understood that without death, there could be no life, and death is not an end, but merely a transition to another form of existence. Mara was depicted as a tall, pale woman with long black hair and piercing, cold eyes. Her skin was as white as snow and just as icy to the touch. She was dressed in dark robes adorned with frost patterns, silver, and ice. In Mara's hands was a staff of black wood, topped with a skull. With one touch of this staff, the goddess could take the life of any creature. Her breath carried the cold of death, and where she passed, rivers froze, plants withered, and animals perished. The ancient Slavs believed that Mara inhabited the north. In the depths of rocks covered with eternal snows, there lay her icy palace, built from the frozen tears of the dead and the bones of those who could not survive the winter. The palace had many halls, each colder than the last, and in the deepest of them, on a throne of transparent ice, sat the goddess herself. receiving the souls of the dead. Eternal blizzards raged around the palace. The howl of the wind never ceased, and the sun never rose above the horizon. Mara was all-powerful, but the bright gods did not give her complete dominion over the world. Every spring, they bound her in chains, depriving her of her strength. Yarilo, the god of the spring sun, shattered with his rays the icy fetters with which the winter goddess bound the earth. Zhiva, the goddess of life, awakened nature from the mortal slumber that Mara imposed. Dashbog, the solar deity, drove away the cold and darkness, returning warmth and light to the world. Under the onslaught of these deities, Mara retreated to her northern domains, where she waited out the summer, gathering strength for her next offensive. But in autumn, as the sun began to weaken, Mara returned. Her arrival was felt in the first frosts, in the yellowing leaves, in the disappearance of birds flying south. With each passing day, the winter goddess's power grew. Nights became longer, days shorter. The cold increasingly bound the earth. By the winter solstice, Mara reached the peak of her might. On the longest night of the year, she reigned supreme, and it seemed that spring would never return, and the world would forever be plunged into icy darkness. The Slavs greeted Mara's arrival with special rituals. In autumn, when the harvest was gathered and the fields lay empty, a straw effigy of the winter goddess was made. It was dressed in torn, dark clothing, smeared with soot to give it a sinister appearance. The effigy was placed at the edge of the village, showing Mara that she was acknowledged and that winter was prepared for. This ritual was not worship but rather an appeasement of a formidable force. People hoped that if Mara's power was acknowledged, she would not be too cruel. The winter would pass relatively mildly, and spring would arrive on time. In winter, Mara became not only the goddess of natural cold but also the mistress of diseases and death. When an epidemic began in a village, when livestock fell ill or people died, the Slavs saw in this Mara's hand. They would parade through the settlement with an effigy or idol of Marina, asking the goddess to take pity, to take away the illness and leave the living in peace. This procession was a solemn and terrifying ritual. A priest or elder carried the image of the goddess, followed by a procession with lit torches, singing incantations. Sometimes, a black chicken or a goat was sacrificed to Mara, left at a crossroads where the boundary between the world of the living and the dead was particularly thin. When an enemy attack or the onset of war was expected, they also turned to Mara. They asked her to allow the spirits of ancestors to be present on the battlefield, who could help the living warriors. It was believed that Mara not only ruled the world of the dead but could also summon them back to the world of the living for a short time. Brave ancestors who fell in battle could return as ghosts and fight alongside their descendants, striking terror into the enemy. The most important ritual associated with Mara was the farewell to winter. As spring approached, but Mara was still unwilling to leave, the Slavs held a festival intended to drive out the winter goddess and summon warmth. A new effigy of Mara was made, this time much more elaborate and frightening. It was carried throughout the village, showing every house that winter was ending. Then the procession moved beyond the village limits to a river or an empty field. There, the effigy was solemnly burned on a large bonfire, or drowned in the river, torn to pieces. This act symbolized the death of death itself, the defeat of Mara, and the return of life. But even after the effigy was burned, Mara did not disappear completely. She retreated, but did not die, for death is immortal. She waited in her northern halls, knowing that autumn would come, and she would return to the world of humans. This eternal cycle of life and death, spring and winter, warmth and cold was the foundation of the Slavic understanding of time. The year was not seen as linear movement forward but as an endless circle, where each goddess and each god received their time of power. On the night of Ivan Kupala, when the boundary between worlds thinned to its limit, another effigy was burned, which was also called Mara. This was not a ritual of expelling winter but a symbolic destruction of all that was dark, evil, and hindering life. Young people jumped over bonfires, purifying themselves from Mara's influence, freeing themselves from the fear of death. It was believed that on this night, one could glimpse the future, learn one's destiny, and see the face of one's destined partner. But it was also dangerous, as Mara could appear to those who too presumptuously tried to penetrate her secrets. In the popular consciousness, Mara was sometimes identified with Mora, the night terror that sat on the chest of a sleeper, causing suffocation. When a person woke up in a cold sweat, unable to move or scream, It was said that Mora had visited them. This was Mara's breath, a reminder that death is close and can come at any moment. To protect themselves from Mora, protective symbols were hung over the bed. Dolls, wreaths of wormwood, rowan branches, and incantations were recited before sleep. In Russian fairy tales, Mara transformed into the image of Marinka the maiden, who tempted bogatirs, trying to lure them into her kingdom of death. In the epic of Dolya and Nedolya, Marinka was an evil sorceress who turned her lovers into turs, golden-horned animals doomed to sacrifice. Dolya resisted her charms but was almost trapped, and only his mother's intervention saved the bogatir from death. This plot reflected the perception of Mara as a temptress who lured people onto the path of death through deception and seduction. Mara was inextricably linked with Veles, the god of the underworld. In some legends, they were presented as spouses, jointly ruling the kingdom of the dead. Veles managed the souls of the deceased and the riches of the underworld, while Mara brought new souls to him, taking life from living beings. Their union was necessary to maintain cosmic order, for without death, the world would overflow with the living, and without new birth, the world of the dead would remain empty. The Slavs' attitude towards Mara was complex and contradictory. On the one hand, she was feared and attempts were made to appease her. On the other hand, her necessity was recognized, and she was even, to some extent, respected. Mara gave peace to the exhausted by illness, freed the hopelessly ill from suffering, and brought the winter sleep that was necessary for nature to regain its strength. Without winter, there could be no spring. Without the death of the old, there could be no birth of the new. Mara was not an enemy of life, but its inevitable companion, the dark side that made the existence of the light possible. Among the deities that Prince Vladimir Sviatoslavich included in his pantheon in 988 inches Kiev, a special place was occupied by the mysterious Simargl. This deity is mentioned in the primary chronicle among the gods to whom the Grand Prince erected idols on the hill near his palace. However, Simargl's functions remained unclear to later researchers, as the Slavic tradition did not preserve detailed myths about this being. Most scholars agree that Simargl had Iranian origins. Its prototype was Simargl, a mythical bird from ancient Persian mythology, a winged guardian, a mediator between heaven and earth. Simargl was depicted as a giant bird with the head of a dog or with a human face, possessing great wisdom and magical abilities. In Persian legends, Simargl lived on the world tree that grew in the middle of the ocean, and its wings were so vast that their flap caused a storm. The appearance of an Iranian deity in the Slavic pantheon is explained by the historical situation that developed in Kiev in the 10th century. The old Russian state actively traded with its eastern neighbors, especially with the steppe nomads, among whom were descendants of the Scythians and Sarmatians, Iranian tribes. Through these contacts, foreign beliefs penetrated Slavic culture. Prince Vladimir, creating a pan-Russian pantheon, sought to unite the deities of various tribes and peoples living under his rule. He included in the pantheon not only traditional Slavic gods but also deities revered by other ethnic groups. In the Slavic tradition, Simargl transformed from a bird into a more complex being. He was depicted as a winged dog or wolf, the guardian of seeds and crops. According to the reconstruction by the famous Soviet historian and archaeologist Boris Alexandrovich Rybakov, Simargl became the deity of vegetation, a symbol of armed good. He guarded seeds in the ground in winter, protected sprouts in spring, and defended ripening fruits. In summer, his wings allowed him to move quickly across the fields, driving away pests, birds of prey, and evil spirits that could ruin the harvest. Simargl was not the primary deity of fertility. That role was held by Mokosh and other gods. He performed an auxiliary role, acting as a guard and protector, rather than a giver of boons. One could say that if Mokosh determined what the harvest would be, Simargl ensured that this harvest would not be destroyed by external threats. He complemented Mokosh's image, forming a unified system of agricultural patronage with her. Another important function of Simargl was mediation between celestial and earthly deities. His wings allowed him to ascend to the highest gods and descend to people, delivering messages in both directions. In this capacity, Simargl was similar to the Greek Hermes or the Scandinavian Valkyries, messengers of the gods. When celestial forces wanted to convey their will to people, they sent Simargl, and he appeared in the form of a sign of a flying fiery bird, an unusual natural phenomenon, or a prophetic dream. Folk perceptions of Simargl were quite weak. compared to other deities of the Slavic pantheon. Ordinary people knew significantly less about him than about Perun, Veles, or Mokosh. This is explained by his secondary role in the mythological system and his foreign origin. Simargl did not become a truly popular deity, remaining more of a princely cult imposed from above within the framework of Vladimir's religious reform. After the adoption of Christianity in Rusas in 988, Simargl disappeared from the religious consciousness of the Slavs faster than other gods. If Perun transformed into Elijah the prophet, Veles into Flas, and Mokosh into Paraskeva Piatnitsa, then no Christian equivalent was found for Simargl. His cult did not have deep popular roots, and therefore, he simply faded into oblivion, leaving only his name in the Chronicles list of Prince Vladimir's gods. Some researchers saw traces of Simargl in Russian folklore in the images of fiery birds and winged wolves. The firebird of fairy tales, whose feathers glow like flames, may be a distant echo of perceptions of Simargl. The flying wolf, the fiery wolf that carries heroes to the thrice-ninth kingdom, could also have originated from the ancient image of the winged guardian. But these connections remain hypothetical, as there is no direct evidence of continuity between Simargl and fairy tale characters. Simargl's idol in Prince Vladimir's Kiev pantheon stood next to Mokosh, which confirms their functional connection. Both deities were related to fertility and harvest. Both were important for the agricultural population of Rus. Together, they formed a pair of masculine and feminine principles: active protection and passive weaving of fate, winged mobility, and the immobile sitting at the spindle. In practical life, Simargl could be invoked in spring, when seeds were sown. Peasants asked him to guard the sowings, to prevent birds from picking out the grains, to protect the sprouts from frost and pests. There may have also been special rituals when priests or elders depicted Simargl's flight, waving their arms, like wings, and running across the sown fields. This ritual was intended to symbolically activate the deity's protective power, to show him the boundaries of the fields he was to guard. Simargl did not enter into conflicts with other gods, did not participate in the cosmic battles between Perun and Veles. He was a neutral figure, fulfilling his modest but important function. This neutrality could also be the reason for his weakness in the popular consciousness. Slavs loved the dramatic, vivid images of warrior gods, gods of love, gods who quarreled, reconciled, and fought for power. Simargl offered no such emotional intensity. He was simply a guard, silent and faithful. When Prince Vladimir adopted Christianity, he ordered the destruction of all idols of the pagan pantheon. Perun was thrown into the Dnieper with special ceremonies. He was beaten with sticks to humiliate the former supreme deity. The other gods were also destroyed, but Simargl disappeared without a trace, as if he had never existed. No one mourned his fall. No one tried to secretly preserve his cult. The winged guardian flew out of the world of humans as unobtrusively as he had once arrived. In the ancient city of Shechekin, which stood in the lands of the Pomeranian Slavs, stood a temple unmatched in all Slavic lands. It was the temple of Triglav, the god with 3 heads, who embodied the triune unity of divine power over the 3 worlds, heaven, earth, and the underworld. The city of Shechesin was famous for its wealth and power, and the shrine of Triglav was a spiritual center where pilgrims flocked from all corners of the Slavic world. Triglav was imagined as a deity with 3 heads looking in different directions. One head saw heaven and celestial gods. The second looked at the earth and people. The third was turned downwards to the underworld of the dead. This depiction symbolized the omniscience and omnipresence of God, his ability to control all levels of the cosmos simultaneously. The eyes of 2 heads were open, and the eyes of the third were covered with a blindfold, for the mysteries of the underworld were to be hidden from the living. According to one interpretation, the 3 heads of Triglav embodied the 3 main Slavic gods, Svarog, Perun, and Svetovid. Svarog represented the celestial forge, the creative force that created the world. Perun embodied earthly power, military might, protection from enemies. Svetovid symbolized the connection with the underworld, knowledge of the past and future, wisdom that comes only through death and rebirth. Together, these 3 deities constituted the fullness of divine power, and Triglav was their unified manifestation. Another version named Dazbog, not Svetovid, as the 3rd face of Triglav. In this case, a divine dynasty emerged. Svarog as the grandfather, Perun as the father, Dashbog as the grandson. 3 generations of gods, bound by blood and a common mission to rule the world, to protect it from chaos, to provide people with everything necessary for life. Such an interpretation emphasized the succession of power, the idea that divine order is passed from ancestors to descendants. The oldest Slavic legend, the Bayan hymn, mentioned Triglav as the embodiment of the unity of Slavic gods. This hymn stated that although the gods differed in names and functions, they were united in their divine essence. Triglav represented this unified essence, showing that the multiplicity of gods is merely different facets of one all-encompassing divine force. Such an understanding brought Slavic religion closer to monotheism, while preserving the multiplicity of divine manifestations. The Temple of Triglav in Szczecin was an architectural marvel of its time. It stood on high pillars draped in black cloth, giving it a mysterious and majestic appearance. Inside the temple, untold treasures were kept: gold, silver, precious stones, brought as offerings to God by rulers, merchants, and warriors. Military trophies captured in battles were also laid at the feet of Triglav's idol, acknowledging his patronage in victories. Triglav's idol was covered in gold, making it shine in the temple's semi-darkness. 3 heads were crowned with a single crown, symbolizing the unity of divine power. In the hands of one head was a sword, a sign of Perun's military might. Another held ears of wheat, a symbol of fertility and prosperity brought by Dashbog. The third hand was empty, for Svetovid's wisdom needed no material attributes. It existed on its own. Near Triglav's temple was a healing spring, whose water possessed miraculous properties. The sick came here to be cured of their ailments. They drank the water, washed their ailing body parts, and left offerings to God, asking for recovery. The priests of Triglav knew special prayers and incantations that enhanced the healing power of the water. The spring was considered the tears of God himself, his gift to humanity, a sign of mercy and love for his worshippers. The servants of Triglav's temple were a powerful caste. They not only performed religious rites but also held great political influence. No important decision in Szczecin was made without consulting the priests of Triglav. They predicted the future using a sacred horse that lived at the temple. This horse was unusually beautiful and was considered the earthly embodiment of divine power. Its hooves never touched unclean ground. It walked only on specially laid white cloths. Divination using the sacred horse was the most important ritual of Triglav's cult. When an important decision needed to be made, whether to start a war, conclude peace, or set out on a long voyage, the priests would bring the horse out of the temple. In front of it, 3 spears were laid in a special cross-shaped arrangement. If the horse stepped over the spears with its right foot, it meant Triglav's blessing. If with its left, the undertaking was doomed to failure. The priests interpreted the horse's behavior, explaining which specific head of Triglav, heavenly, earthly, or underworld, had given its answer. Triglav was revered by all Slavs, but the Pomeranian tribes worshipped him with particular fervor. For them, this god was not just one of many deities but the supreme ruler, equal to or even surpassing Perun himself. This might be due to the fact that the Pomeranians lived in constant danger. Vikings came from the sea, German feudal lords pressed from the west, and other Slavic tribes threatened from the south. In such a situation, they needed a god who could see all dangers at once, protect from all sides, and know the past, present, and future. Triglav gave them this assurance. The cult of Triglav had much in common with the cult of Radagast, another 3-headed god worshipped by the Lutici, a neighboring Slavic tribe. Both deities were depicted with 3 heads. Both were associated with war and wisdom. Both had luxurious temples with untold treasures. Some researchers believe that Triglav and Radagast were different names for the same deity, worshipped by different tribes under different names. This reflected a pan-Slavic idea of the tripartite division of the world and the tripartite structure of divine authority. A sacred grove surrounded Triglav's temple. In this grove, it was forbidden to hunt, cut down trees, or even talk loudly. Violators of this prohibition were punished by death, as it was believed that desecrating the sacred grove would bring God's wrath upon the entire city. The grove was a place where priests performed secret rites, inaccessible to ordinary people. Here they communicated with spirits, summoned the dead for prophecy, and performed human sacrifices in particularly important cases. Human sacrifices to Triglav were rare, only in extreme situations when the city was threatened by mortal danger. The victim was usually a prisoner of war, less often a criminal condemned to death for particularly grave crimes. He was brought to the temple. The priests performed a lengthy purification ritual. Then the victim was slaughtered before the idol, and the blood was collected in a sacred chalice. This blood was used for divination. The priests watched how it flowed down the steps of the altar and predicted the future from the pattern of the streams. Festivals in honor of Triglav were the most magnificent of the year. On the main festival, celebrated in autumn after the harvest, representatives of all neighboring tribes gathered in Szczecin. The celebrations lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Feasts, contests, sacrifices. Warriors demonstrated their combat skills. Merchants concluded deals. Young people looked for partners. On these days, Triglav's temple was open to all, and ordinary people could see the splendor of the divine idol, covered in gold and precious stones. When German feudal lords began the crusades against the Baltic Slavs in the 10th century, Triglav's temple became the object of particular hatred for Christian missionaries. They saw in it a stronghold of pagan resistance, a symbol of Slavic independence. In 1124, German troops captured Szczecin. The first thing they did was destroy Triglav's temple, burn the sacred grove, and kill the priests. The golden idol was chopped into pieces, and the 3 heads were sent to Germany as trophies and proof of Christianity's victory over paganism. The fall of Triglav's temple became a turning point in the history of the Baltic Slavs. Without their main sanctuary, without the priests who united the scattered tribes, they could not offer organized resistance to German expansion. Over the next century, all West Slavic lands were conquered, Christianized, and Germanized. The memory of Triglav survived only in chronicles and in the names of some places where its sanctuaries once stood. Slavic gods did not exist in isolation from each other. They were part of a complex system where each deity occupied its place and performed specific functions, interacting with other forces of the cosmos. This system was not a rigid hierarchy, as in Greek mythology with its Olympus, where Zeus unconditionally ruled all other gods. The Slavic pantheon was more flexible and dynamic, reflecting the idea of the world as a constantly changing balance of opposing forces. At the center of this system was the idea of dualism, the opposition of 2 fundamental forces, order and chaos, light and darkness, life and death. Perun, the thunderer and warrior, personified celestial order, law, the power of the prince and his retinue. Veles, the lord of cattle and the underworld, represented chthonic power, the wealth of the earth, secret knowledge that comes through death. Their confrontation was eternal, but not absolute. Both gods were necessary for the existence of the world, and their conflict maintained the balance between the celestial and the earthly, between warrior valor and the wisdom of the Volkwers. Zhiva and Mara formed another pair of opposites, spring and winter, life and death, warmth and cold. Their struggle determined the annual cycle, the change of seasons. When Zhiva triumphed, the world flourished, filled with life, light, joy. When Mara gained the upper hand, nature slept. The earth was covered with snow. Life froze in anticipation of a new awakening. But their confrontation did not mean enmity. Both goddesses performed their task in the cosmic order, and without one, the other could not exist. Mokosh, the great spinner of fates, stood somewhat apart from these conflicts. She did not engage in open struggle with other gods but influenced everything that happened, for the destinies of people and gods depended on her. Even the mighty Perun could not change what Mokosh had spun. Her power was absolute in her sphere, and other deities respected her decisions. When a person's time to die came, Mokosh broke their thread, and no prayers, no sacrifices could prevent it. Mokosh's 2 daughters, Dolya and Nedolya, executed their mother's will on earth. They were her hands that distributed happiness and misfortune, according to the pattern woven on the great spindle of fate. Mokosh determined the overall pattern of a person's life, and the daughters filled it with specific events. If Mokosh decided that a person would be happy, Dolya came to them. If fate ordained suffering, Nedolya appeared. But sometimes the sisters changed places for no apparent reason, and then a happy person suddenly became unhappy, and a failure found prosperity. Simargl, the winged guardian, served as a mediator between different levels of the divine hierarchy. When celestial gods needed to convey their will to earthly deities or people, they sent Simargl. He flew through all 3 worlds, heaven, earth, and the underworld, and delivered the message to its destination. In this capacity, he was indispensable, as other gods could not move so freely between worlds. Perun ruled in heaven, Veles in the underworld, and only Simargl had access everywhere. Triglav embodied the unity of the entire divine pantheon. His three heads symbolized not only the three worlds but also three fundamental divine functions: creation, preservation, and destruction. Svarog created the world in his celestial forge, forging the sun, moon, stars, and earth. Perun maintained this world, protecting it from enemies, punishing violators of cosmic law. Veles, or Svetovid, destroyed the obsolete, making way for new creation. The circle closed, and everything began anew. There were also kinship ties between the gods, which strengthened the structure of the pantheon. Svarog was the father of many gods. Dashbog, Simargl, possibly Perun. He represented the older generation of deities, the creators of the world, who had now stepped back, yielding the active role to their children. Dashbog, the solar deity, was Svarog's grandson and continued his grandfather's work, giving the world light and warmth. Perun, Svarog's son, took on the protection of the created order. Lada, the goddess of love and harmony, was the mother of Zhiva and other deities of fertility. She personified the maternal principle of the cosmos, the gentle force that unites the disparate, reconciles the hostile, and gives rise to new life. Without Lada, the world would be only struggle and conflict. She introduced the element of love that made continued existence possible. Rod, the supreme deity among the East Slavs, was considered the progenitor of all gods and people. Svarog and Lada descended from him, and all other deities from them. Rod was so ancient and all-encompassing that his cult gradually merged with the cult of ancestors in general. Reverence for Rod meant reverence for all departed generations, the entire chain of ancestors who gave life to the living. The gods also interacted with lower-level spirits: house spirits, domovoi, forest spirits, leshi, water spirits, vodianoi, mermaids, rusalki. These beings were not deities in the full sense, but possessed significant power within their limited spheres. The domovoi managed the life of the house, the leshi, the forest, the vodianoi, the river or lake. The gods did not interfere in the affairs of these spirits unless absolutely necessary, recognizing their autonomy, but in critical situations, they could summon spirits for help or punish them for misdeeds. Priests and volkevi served as intermediaries between people and gods. They knew which god to appeal to in each specific case, what sacrifices to make, what words to utter. Perun's priests blessed warriors before battle, performed rituals to invoke rain during droughts. Veles's priests healed livestock, helped merchants make profitable deals, and escorted the deceased to the afterlife. Mokosh's priestesses assisted in childbirth, blessed marriages, and divined fate. Kapishcha, places of worship to the gods, were built taking into account the peculiarities of each deity. Perun's Kapishcha was located on a high hill, open to the sky, as the thunderer resided in the clouds. Perun's idol was the tallest. It was made of oak, the sacred tree of the god of thunder. Veles's Kapishcha was located in a lowland near water, often in a cave or a dense forest, as the lord of the underworld preferred dark, hidden places. Mokosh's Kapishche were built in the center of a settlement, where women gathered for shared work and conversation. The annual cycle of festivals reflected the interaction of the gods. The winter solstice Koljata marked the turn towards light, the beginning of the weakening of Mara's power, and preparation for Zhiva's return. The spring equinox signified the final victory of life over death, when Zhiva drove Mara into her northern domains. The summer solstice, Kupalo, was the peak of the power of solar gods, Dashbog and Yarilo. The autumn equinox marked the beginning of Mara's return and preparation for winter. Each festival included rituals dedicated to several gods simultaneously. On Koljata, the sun was honored, but the deceased ancestors connected with Veles were also commemorated. On Kupalo, people jumped over bonfires in honor of Svarog's fire, but also practiced divination, invoking the help of Lada and Mokosh. On the autumn equinox, thanks were given for the harvest to all fertility gods: Mokosh, Zhiva, Veles, Simargl. The Slavs did not see contradictions in having many gods. Each was responsible for his sphere, and together they created a complete picture of the world. The world was too complex for one god to manage everything. Perun was needed for war and justice, Veles for wealth and wisdom, Mokosh for fate and women's affairs, Zhiva for life and fertility, Mara for death and winter. Only altogether could they ensure the existence of the cosmos. The adoption of Christianity did not destroy this complex system instantly. Gods transformed, adapted to new conditions, merged with Christian saints, but the connections between them were preserved in popular memory, in rituals, in fairy tales. Ilya, the prophet who replaced Perun, also rode across the sky in a fiery chariot and hurled thunderbolts. Saint Vlas, who replaced Veles, patronized livestock. Paraskeva Pietnitsa, into whom Mokosh transformed, remained the patroness of women's work and family well-being. Slavic religion was not just a system of beliefs. It included a branched ritual practice that permeated every aspect of a person's life from birth to death. Every important event was accompanied by rituals designed to attract the blessings of the gods and ward off evil forces. These rituals were performed at specific times, in specific places, with strict adherence to rules, the violation of which could lead to dire consequences. Sacrifices were a central element of Slavic cult. The Slavs believed that gods needed offerings from humans, that these gifts sustained divine power and inclined the gods to mercy. Sacrifices varied depending on the situation and the deity to whom they were intended. The simplest were bloodless sacrifices: bread, kasha, honey, beer, milk. They were offered regularly, in ordinary circumstances, thanking the gods for everyday blessings. Bread was sacred food, a symbol of fertility and labor. The first baked bread from the new harvest was always taken to the kapishche, or the home altar, dedicated to Mokosh or Veles. The bread was broken into pieces, leaving a portion for the gods, a portion for ancestral spirits, and the rest eaten by the entire family. This ritual was called Zazinki, and it marked the beginning of a new annual cycle, when the earth again provided sustenance for people. Honey and beer were also favorite gifts to the gods. They were poured onto the ground at the foot of idols, poured into sacred springs, left in forests for the leshy. Fermented drinks were considered drinks of the gods, capable of connecting the world of humans with the world of deities. During major festivals, huge cauldrons of beer or kvass were brewed, and a portion was always dedicated to the gods, poured into the fire or into the earth with appropriate prayers. Bloody sacrifices were more serious, and were offered on important occasions. Most often, domestic animals were sacrificed: roosters, hens, sheep, goats, bulls. The choice of animal depended on the deity and the importance of the request. Bulls or horses were appropriate for Perun, rams or pigs for Veles, hens or sheep for Mokosh. The animal had to be healthy, without defects, as no flawed sacrifice could be offered to the gods. The sacrifice ritual was performed solemnly. The animal was led to the kapishche, adorned with ribbons and flowers. The priest sprinkled it with holy water, recited prayers, invoking the god to accept the gift. Then the animal was killed with a single blow, trying to do it quickly so as not to cause suffering. The blood was collected in a chalice and poured onto the altar or at the foot of the idol. Part of the meat was burned on the sacred fire, and the rest was eaten by the participants of the ritual at a ritual feast. Human sacrifices among the Slavs were rare, and were made only in extreme situations, during severe drought, epidemics, or enemy invasions. The victim was usually a foreign prisoner of war, sometimes a criminal. In some cases, the victim was chosen by lot from volunteers who believed that their death would save the tribe and ensure them an honorable place in the afterlife. Such sacrifices were offered to Perun, asking for his help in war, or to Triglav in critical moments of the city's existence. In addition to sacrifices, there were purification rituals. Fire was considered the main purifying element. On Kupalo, people jumped over bonfires, purifying themselves from the accumulated defilement of the year. The sick were fumigated with smoke from sacred herbs: mugwort, street john's wort, thistle. Houses after the death of an occupant were fumigated to drive out the spirits of illness and death. Warriors after battle passed between two bonfires, leaving in the fire the blood and death that had defiled them. Water was also a means of purification. Washing in a river or lake, especially at dawn, washed away sins and ailments. Water from springs, which gushed from under the earth, possessed particularly strong purifying power. Such springs were considered sacred. They were dedicated to various deities and spirits. The sick, infertile women, and people seeking forgiveness for transgressions came to them. Divination was an important part of religious practice. The Slavs sought to know the will of the gods, to predict the future, to understand the causes of misfortunes. They divined in various ways: by the flight of birds, by the entrails of sacrificial animals, by the behavior of sacred horses, by fire, by water, by grains. Each method had its rules and required specific knowledge for interpreting the results. Wax divination was the most common. Melted wax was poured into cold water, and future events were judged by the solidified figures. The diviner had to be in a special state after fasting, without extraneous thoughts, fully concentrated on the question. The resulting wax figures were interpreted by experienced old women who knew the meaning of each shape and each curl. Such divinations were usually performed around New Year's, or before important events: weddings, departures on long journeys, the start of house construction. Incantations were verbal formulas intended to influence reality through appeals to gods and spirits. There were incantations for all occasions: for health, for love, for success in business, for protection from enemies, for harvest. Each incantation had a strict structure. It began with an appeal to the gods, then described the desired outcome, and ended with a reinforcing formula. The incantation had to be spoken at a specific time, in a specific place, and with a specific tone. Incantations spoken at dawn were considered particularly powerful. When the boundary between night and day is blurred, meaning the boundary between worlds is thin, at that time words had special power, could penetrate different realities, and change the course of events. Healers and seers would rise before dawn, go to water, or into the forest, and there, in complete solitude, recite their spells. Amulets protected against evil forces, illnesses, and the evil eye. They were made from various materials: metal, wood, fabric, stone. The shape of the amulet was important. Solar symbols, images of gods, geometric patterns carrying magical meaning. Every person wore amulets from childhood. They were hung over the entrance to the house, over the cradle of an infant, on livestock. Women embroidered amulet patterns on their clothes, creating an invisible shield around their bodies. Particularly powerful amulets were those passed down from generation to generation. It was believed that such an amulet accumulated the power of the clan, the memory of ancestors, and protected not only its wearer but also their entire family. The loss of a family amulet was a serious misfortune, signifying a break in the connection with ancestors and the loss of their patronage. Oaths were given before the gods and had absolute power. To break an oath meant to incur the wrath of the deity, which led to inevitable punishment. Therefore, oaths were rarely taken, only on truly important occasions. Treaties between princes were sealed with an oath before the idol of Perun. Warriors swore loyalty to their prince until death. Spouses swore fidelity to each other. Such oaths were spoken loudly in the presence of witnesses with a sacrifice that sealed the words. There was also the ritual of blood brotherhood. When two people became sworn brothers, they mixed their blood, drank it, swore before the gods to be like blood brothers, to help each other in everything, and to avenge each other's grievances. Such a bond was considered even stronger than blood kinship, as blood brothers are bound by birth, while sworn brothers chose each other voluntarily. Funeral rites were particularly complex and important. Death was seen not as an end, but as a transition to another world. And this transition had to be performed correctly. The deceased was washed, dressed in the best clothes, placed in a coffin or on a boat, along with items that might be needed in the afterlife. The wealthy were buried with weapons, jewelry, utensils, even with horses and servants who were killed, so that they could serve their master after death. Between people and gods stood intermediaries, those who dedicated their lives to serving divine forces. They were called by different names: priests, volkovas, kudesniki, viduni, but all possessed special knowledge, a special connection with the world of gods and spirits. Their role in Slavic society was immense. They influenced all important decisions: the well-being of the tribe, success in war, harvest, the health of people and livestock depended on them. Priests were keepers of temples and kapishche, performers of official rites, interpreters of the god's will. They belonged to a special caste that passed knowledge from generation to generation. Not everyone could become a priest. Special abilities were required, which manifested from childhood. The ability to see visions and dreams, to hear the voices of spirits, to heal by touch. Such children were taken from their parents and raised in temples under the guidance of senior priests. The education was long and difficult. A young priest had to learn all the prayers and incantations, know the calendar of festivals, be able to interpret signs, understand medicinal herbs, and speak the language of birds and animals. He studied the movement of stars, as the best time for sowing, for weddings, for military campaigns was determined by celestial bodies. He learned wood carving to create idols, and blacksmithing to make sacred objects from metal. High-ranking priests had immense power. In Archon on the island of Rugen, the high priest of Svetovid's temple was the de facto ruler of the island. His word meant more than the prince's. No one dared disobey his commands, as it was believed he spoke on behalf of God himself. This priest alone could enter the Holy of Holies of the temple, where the idol of Svetovid stood, human height with 4 faces looking in all 4 cardinal directions. Every autumn, the high priest of Archon performed the most important divination ritual for the next year's harvest. Before Svetovid's idol stood a large horn filled with honey. The priest entered the sanctuary, emerged with the horn, and checked if the honey level had decreased. If the level had not changed or had risen, God had drunk the honey and promised a good year. If it had decreased, it meant difficulties lay ahead. After this, the priest poured out the old honey and filled the horn with new honey for the next year. Priests were inviolable. Even enemies who captured the temple did not dare to touch a priest, for they feared the wrath of the gods. When German crusaders destroyed Slavic sanctuaries, they sometimes let priests go alive, demanding only that they accept Christianity. Some agreed, becoming Christian priests, secretly preserving the old faith. Others refused and met their death, remaining faithful to their gods until the end. Volkves differed from temple priests. They were not tied to a specific sanctuary but wandered the land, offering their services to those in need of magical help. Volkves were more shamanic in nature. Their power came not from official status but from personal connection with spirits. They could enter a trance, travel with their soul to other worlds, summon the dead, inflict and remove curses. Princely Volfers served at the courts of rulers, gave advice, predicted the outcome of battles, and healed wounds. Their opinion carried weight in making important decisions. The chronicle tells of Volkves who predicted Prince Oleg's death from his horse. The prince did not believe it, parted with the horse, but many years later came to see the bones of his beloved animal. A snake emerged from the horse's skull and bit Oleg, from which he died, confirming the Volkves' prophecy. Women could also be servants of the gods. They were called witches, sorceresses, or prophetesses. They specialized in female magic, assisted in childbirth, treated female ailments, performed love charms and revulsions, and divined about future spouses. Old witches were keepers of ancient knowledge, which was passed down only from woman to woman. They knew the secrets of herbs, could stop bleeding, could help an infertile woman conceive or, conversely, terminate an unwanted pregnancy. Some witches specialized in dark magic. For a fee, they inflicted curses, confusion, and diseases upon the employer's enemies. Such witches were feared and avoided, but at the same time, their services were used when one wanted revenge on an enemy without getting one's hands dirty with blood. It was believed that an evil witch had sold her soul to dark forces and would find no rest after death, but would roam the earth as an upper or nav, harming the living. There were also white witches, healers, who helped all who suffered. They healed with herbs, incantations, and laying on of hands. People came to them with children who did not sleep at night, with joint pain, with fever, with toothache. A white witch never took payment in advance. She only accepted what was given willingly. After healing, her home was full of dried herbs, roots, strange objects used in rituals. The training of Volkesh and witches was a dangerous undertaking. A disciple had to undergo trials that broke ordinary perception of the world and opened a vision of other realities. The disciple would be taken to the forest, left alone for several days without food and water, so that they would encounter spirits and receive power from them. Sometimes a disciple did not return, perishing or going mad. Those who endured the trials gained magical abilities and became full-fledged Volkevs. The power of Volkers was based on fear and respect. People believed that a Volkev could kill or heal with a single word, bring pestilence upon livestock, cause or banish rain, make a warrior invulnerable in battle, or condemn him to certain death. Therefore, people tried not to quarrel with Volkevs, fulfilled their demands, and made offerings. At the same time, Volkevs were feared, not invited into homes without extreme necessity, and children were protected from their gaze. After the adoption of Christianity, the status of priests in Volkurvs sharply declined. The church declared them servants of the devil, and their practices witchcraft and heresy. Temples were destroyed, idols burned, priests killed or forced to be baptized. But Volkurvs, not tied to temples, continued to act, retreating into remote forests, hiding in distant villages. Their activities became secret, but the demand for their services did not disappear. Christian priests fought against Volkurvs for centuries, but could not eradicate them. Ordinary people continued to turn to them, especially in villages where Christianity remained superficial for a long time. Volkurvs adapted, began to use Christian symbols alongside pagan ones, and prayers to saints along with incantations to old gods. A syncretic magical tradition emerged, combining elements of both religions. In the 10th century, there were several uprisings on Ruses led by Volkurvs. During the famine of 1071, Volkurvs in the Rostov land incited the people against Christian boyars, accusing them of hiding grain. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by the prince's retinue. Volkurvs were executed, but this did not stop the resistance. For a long time, Volkurvs tried to return people to the old faith, predicting the imminent end of Christianity and the return of the pagan gods. By the 10th century, organized priesthood had completely disappeared. There were no longer temples, public rites, or official cults, but folk magic survived in the form of healing, sorcery, and witchcraft. Healers in Russian villages up to the 20th century performed the same functions as Volkafers and witches in pagan times. They healed, divined, removed curses, and helped in matters of love. The church condemned them, but people continued to visit them, as the need for magical assistance did not disappear with the change of faith. The Slavs did not build many monumental temples like the Greeks or Romans. Their religion was more natural. Many rituals were performed outdoors, in sacred groves, near springs, on hilltops. But this does not mean they had no sanctuaries. In the major cities of the West and Baltic Slavs, wooden temples rose, not inferior in magnificence to Christian churches, and sometimes surpassing them. The most famous was the Temple of Svetovid in Arkon, on the island of Rugen. It was a veritable temple city, surrounded by strong walls. The center of the complex was the sanctuary, where the statue of the four-faced god towered. The temple walls were adorned with carvings depicting scenes from myths, battles of gods, the creation of the world, and the exploits of heroes. Untold riches were kept inside. Gold, silver, precious weapons, accumulated over centuries. The temple owned vast lands, cultivated by dependent people, who brought income to the sanctuary's treasury. Svetovid's sacred horse was white, huge, and cared for better than any prince's steed. It was kept in special stables at the temple, fed choice oats, and given pure spring water. No one, except the high priest, could touch it. Even when the horse was brought out for divination, the priest led it by a special golden bridle, never riding it, for it was God's horse, not a human's. In Szczecin, Triglav's temple rivaled the Arconian sanctuary in wealth. The three heads of the idol were covered in gold, and the eyes were inlaid with precious stones. Around the temple grew a sacred oak grove, where cutting down trees was forbidden. The old oaks reached incredible sizes. Their trunks were so thick that 3 men could not embrace them. Under these oaks, priests performed secret rites, the results of which were not disclosed even to princes. On Rus, before the adoption of Christianity, large sanctuaries also existed. The most famous was the Kapishcha in Kiev, arranged by Prince Vladimir in 988. On the hill near the prince's palace, idols of 6 gods were erected: Perun, Horz, Dazhbog, Strybog, Simargl, and Mokosh. Perun stood in the center, towering over the others. His idol was carved from oak, his head of silver, and his mustache of gold. In front of the idols, a fire burned constantly, maintained by priests. This Kapishcha existed for only 8 years. In 996, Vladimir adopted Christianity and ordered the destruction of pagan gods. Perun was tied to the tails of horses, dragged through the city, beaten with sticks, and then thrown into the Dnieper. 12 warriors walked along the bank and pushed the idol away from the bank with poles until it passed the rapids. This symbolic expulsion of the supreme god was intended to show the people that the old gods were powerless against the Christian god. But in the remote regions of Ruses, pagan sanctuaries persisted for a long time. In the Rostov land, among the Finno-Ugric tribes of Meria and Vasi, Kapishcha operated until the 10th century. Christian missionaries, at risk to their lives, penetrated there, trying to preach the new faith, but often met resistance. Saint Abraham of Rostov in the 10th century destroyed Velis's Kapishche on the shore of Lake Rostov. But the local inhabitants tried to restore it several times. Sacred groves were the most common type of sanctuary. There was no need to build a temple. Nature itself created the necessary atmosphere. Tall trees formed a natural vault, resembling a temple roof. The rustling of leaves was perceived as the voice of the gods. Sunbeams piercing through the branches created a play of light and shadow, mysterious and enchanting. In the center of the grove, an idol was usually placed, or simply one particularly large old oak was left, considered the embodiment of a god. The oak was Perun's sacred tree. It was believed that the thunderer particularly loved oaks, and lightning often struck these mighty trees. An oak struck by lightning became doubly sacred. It was marked by God himself. Splinters from such a tree were kept as amulets. They protected against fire, illness, and evil spirits. Under sacred oaks, the most important rituals were performed, sacrifices were made, and oaths were sworn. The birch was the tree of female deities, Lada, Mokosh, Zhiva. Its white bark symbolized purity, tenderness, the feminine principle. In birch groves, spring rituals were held, round dances were danced, and wreaths were woven. Maidens came to the birches with requests for love, for marriage, for children. They tied colorful ribbons to the branches. Each ribbon was a prayer addressed to the goddess. The willow grew by the water and was considered a link between the earthly and underworld. Under willows, suicides and unbaptized infants were buried, those who had no place in ordinary cemeteries. The willow was the tree of sorrow, death, but also of transformation. Its branches, thrown into the water, easily took root, giving new life. This symbolized rebirth after death, the eternal cycle of being. Springs, streams, and wells were sacred places of water deities and spirits. Each spring had its guardian spirit or nymph, who had to be honored. Before drawing water, one should greet the spirit, leave a small offering, a coin, a piece of bread, a flower. Water from sacred springs was considered healing, attributed with miraculous properties. Washing with such water could rid one of illness, the evil eye, or sins. Some springs were known far beyond their locality. Pilgrimages were made to them. People walked tens of versts to wash in the healing water and take some with them. Settlements arose around such springs, where servants lived who maintained the purity of the holy place, received pilgrims, and interpreted signs. After Christianization, many pagan springs were reconsecrated in honor of Christian saints, but the people continued to revere them in the same way. Mountains and hills were also sacred. Temples were built on their summits, as man was closer to heaven, to the celestial gods. From there, from above, a wide view opened up. One could see the enemy from afar, and in a ritual sense, survey the boundaries of one's world. An idol on a hilltop was visible from afar, reminding of God's presence. It was particularly dangerous on hilltops during thunderstorms. Lightning struck there more often, making such places even more fearsome and sacred. Caves were considered entrances to the underworld, to the domain of Velis and Mara. In caves, rituals related to death and rebirth were performed. Sacrifices were left there for the underworld gods. Volkvers descended there to communicate with ancestral spirits. The darkness of the cave, the cold emanating from the depths of the earth, the echo that distorted sounds. All this created a sense of the presence of something powerful and dangerous. Not everyone dared to enter a sacred cave. It required courage and purity of intentions. Crossroads were border places where paths intersected, and therefore, the boundary between worlds was thinned. Sacrifices to spirits were left there. The graves of suicides were located there, and magical rituals were performed there. A traveler passing by a crossroads at night would certainly cross themselves or utter incantations, protecting themselves from possible danger. Household sanctuaries existed in every home. The red corner, where images of gods and ancestors stood, was the sacred center of the dwelling. The first sheaf of the new harvest was placed there. Family amulets were kept there. Prayers were offered there before meals and before sleep. The domovoi, the guardian spirit of the house, lived behind the stove or under the threshold, and he too had to be honored. with offerings left for him, and conversations held with him, asking for advice. The year 988 became a turning point in the history of Slavic paganism in Rus. Prince Vladimir Sviatoslavich, previously a zealous pagan who had established a pantheon of gods in Kiev, made the decision to be baptized. The reasons were political. Rus needed an alliance with Byzantium, and the Byzantine emperor demanded a single faith. Christianity also provided an ideological justification for princely power. Whereas pagan priests could compete with secular rulers, the baptism of Rus was a violent process. The Kievans were driven into the Dnieper and baptized en masse, without prior preparation, without explanation of the new faith. Many did not understand what was happening. They thought it was another magical ritual of the prince. Idols were destroyed, priests were killed or exiled, temples were burned. Christian churches began to be built in their place, often using stones and wood from the destroyed kapishche. But the conversion of the people to the new faith could not happen instantly. Paganism was not just a religion, but a way of life, a way of understanding the world that had developed over centuries. People continued to secretly pray to the old gods, perform familiar rituals, and celebrate pagan festivals. Christian priests fought against this, declaring pagan practices demonic and threatening excommunication and eternal damnation. But the result was slow. Gradually, duotheism emerged, where Christianity and paganism coexisted, intertwined and influencing each other. The old gods did not disappear. They transformed into Christian saints. Perun became Elijah the prophet, who also rode across the sky in a fiery chariot and hurled thunderbolts. Veles turned into Vlas, the patron of domestic livestock. Mokosh became Paraskiva Piatnitsa, the saint patroness of women and handicrafts. People prayed to these saints, but in their hearts, they remembered who they had been before. Pagan festivals also survived under Christian names. Koljata, the winter solstice, merged with Christmas. Maslenitsa, the farewell to winter and the welcome of spring, preceded Great Lent. Kupalo, the summer solstice, merged with the feast of John the Baptist. The church could not ban these festivals. They were too deeply rooted in the popular consciousness, so it tried to reinterpret them, to fill them with Christian content. Paganism survived more strongly in villages than in cities. Peasants, whose lives were entirely dependent on nature, on the harvest, on livestock, could not abandon the old gods who had helped them for centuries. They went to church, were baptized, confessed, and received communion. But at home, they continued to revere the domovoi, perform rituals for the spirits of fields and forests, and practice divination on Christmastide in the pagan way. Women preserved the old faith longer than men. Motherhood, handicrafts, and household management were spheres where women felt in charge, and it was there that pagan traditions were particularly tenacious. Midwives who assisted in childbirth used incantations and rituals whose roots went back to paganism. Embroiderers adorned clothing with ancient symbols, solar signs, images of Mokosh, protective patterns passed down from generation to generation. Fairy tales became repositories of pagan mythology. Baba Yaga is a transformed image of Mara, the mistress of death. Koshchei the Deathless is the embodiment of an underworld god, guardian of treasures. Zmai Gorinik is the enemy of the Thunderer, whom Perun fought. The Firebird is an echo of Simargl, or other solar beings. Listening to fairy tales, children absorbed ancient myths without realizing their religious significance. Proverbs and sayings preserved the memory of pagan beliefs. If there were no happiness, then unhappiness would have helped reflect the idea of Dolya and Nedolya. God will not abandon you. A pig will not eat you, is a syncretic phrase combining the Christian God with the pagan animal Veles. After a drizzle on Thursday is a hint at Perun's day. Thursday, when a thundery rain was expected. The ritual calendar of Russian Christianity up to the 20th century remained pagan in essence. Spring incantations to birds, summer kupalo bonfires, autumn sacrifices of harvest, winter divination, all this was a legacy of the pre-Christian era. The church tried to eradicate these customs. Priests delivered sermons against superstitions, but to no avail. The tradition proved stronger than the official religion. In the 19th century, when scientific study of folk culture began in Russia, ethnographers discovered with surprise how persistent pagan survivals were. They recorded incantations that mentioned the names of ancient gods. They found rituals in remote villages that were hundreds of years old. They saw peasants praying simultaneously to icons and idols, finding no contradiction in this. Slavophiles and romantics idealized the pagan past, seeing in it the source of national identity. They contrasted the organic Slavic paganism with alien Byzantine Christianity. These views were an exaggeration, but they contained a grain of truth. The Slavs indeed created a unique religious system that reflected their worldview, their connection with nature, and their values. In the 20th century, under Soviet rule, attempts were made to revive interest in the pagan heritage as an element of folk culture, cleansed of religious content. Rituals, songs, and fairy tales were studied, but as folklore, not as a living tradition. Paradoxically, the persecution of Christianity to some extent contributed to the preservation of older layers of culture, which were perceived not as religion but as folk art. At the end of the 20th century, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a movement of neo-paganism began. People disillusioned with Christianity and materialism tried to return to the faith of their ancestors. They revived rituals, erected idols, and celebrated ancient holidays, but this was more of a reconstruction than a continuation of tradition. The living chain of transmission had been broken centuries ago, and what neo-pagans created was a novelty, based more on books and imagination than on real memory. Nevertheless, the influence of Slavic paganism on Russian culture is undeniable. It lives on in language, in customs, in worldview. A Russian person, even if they are a Christian or an atheist, carries within them the genetic memory of their ancestors' gods. They feel the sacredness of the forest, the power of thunder, the magic of spring. They intuitively understand the symbolism of ancient ornaments, the rhythm of folk songs, the meaning of fairy tale characters. The gods did not die. They dissolved into culture, transformed, and continued to exist in new forms. Perun thunders in summer storms. Velas wanders through the forests. Mokosh sits at her spindle in the guise of a grandmother telling fairy tales to her grandchildren. Zhiva awakens nature every spring. Mara covers the earth with snow every winter. Dolya and Nedolya continue to distribute happiness and misfortune to people, without asking what gods they believe in. The memory of Slavic gods is part of the people's identity, a connection with ancestors, roots that go back millennia. As long as we tell their stories, study their cult, and feel their presence in nature and culture, they exist.